In this lesson, we're going to look at move, scale, rotate, and duplicate. Now, these 4 functions are very, very important, and you will probably use them on a daily basis when you are using Blender. So you're going to move objects around, you're going to rotate your objects, scale them, and also duplicate things. And yeah, it's one of those things that you're going to use quite a lot. So let's delete everything in the scene. So I'm going to select everything like this. Another shortcut that you can use to select everything in the scene is simply pressing A on the keyboard, A for all, and as you can see, it will select everything in the scene. Now I can press X to delete, and then just click delete to delete all those objects. Now let's create something simple like a cube. So I'm going to press Shift A, and then it's going to bring up the add menu, then point to mesh, and then select cube from the drop down. So that's going to create a new cube object for us. So make sure you have your cube selected. So as you can see, if I click on it, it will have a little outline. That way you know that it's selected. And to move something around, we're going to use the shortcut G. G for grab. So press G just once. And now if you move your mouse around, you'll see that you are moving that cube around. So you are grabbing it and moving it around. And then if you click somewhere, you have now moved that cube to a new location. As you can see, it's moving freely in the 3D space, so I can move it down or wherever I want to. And that's basically to just move an object around. To rotate, you will use the R shortcut, R for rotate. So with the cube selected, press R, and as you can see, we can now rotate our cube. Very, very simple. Another thing that you can do is you can scale your object, and the shortcut for that is S. S for scale. So make sure you have your cube selected, press S once, and now you can move the mouse, and you can see that you can make the cube smaller or bigger. Something to note is where your cursor is when you press the shortcut. So if I'm really, really close to the object and I press S for scale, you can see that I only have this little movement here to scale this object. If I press escape, it's going to cancel that action. And if I move my cursor further away from the object and then press S to scale, I have much more control to kind of move my cursor around to scale the object. The same goes for rotate and move. So if I'm really, really close to the object with my cursor and I press R, you'll see that it's going to kind of just move like that. But if I move my cursor further away and then press R, it's going to give me that much more control or more accurate control. Next, let's see how we can duplicate our object. So to duplicate an object, make sure that you select that object, and then the shortcut is Shift D. D for duplicate. So hold Shift, press D once, and now you can just move your mouse and you can see that we've created a duplicate object or a duplicate copy of that object. I can also select both of these objects now and press Shift D to duplicate both of them. Now we've got 4 cubes. You can also select all of them and press G to grab them all and move them all at the same time. You can click to reposition them, and you can also do the same with rotate. So with all of the objects selected, press R, and then I can rotate them all like this. Or we can press S and we can scale them like this. Okay, let's delete all these objects. So press A to select all of them, press X, and then click on delete to delete all the objects in the scene. Now let's create a new cube. So press Shift A, Mesh, Cube to create a new cube. Now let's say you want to move this cube, but you only want to move it on the X-axis, which is the red line. You can look at the axes here and you can see X is the red line. So let's say I would just want to move this cube, but only on the X-axis. Now to do that, select your cube, then press G to grab it, and then press X to specify that you only want to grab it on the X-axis. Now if I move my mouse, you can see that that cube is only moving on the X-axis. I can't move it up and down. I can't move it on the green line or the y-axis. It's only moving on that x-axis. Let's press escape to cancel that, and let's try it with the y-axis. So with the cube selected, press G to grab, and then Y, and that's then gonna specify that you only want to grab it on the y-axis. So you can obviously just click and that will save or place the location, or you can just press escape to cancel that. I'm going to undo that, so I'm going to press Control Z, and let's try and grab it in the z-axis. Now the z-axis is up and down, so with the cube selected, press G to grab, and then Z to move it up and down on the z-axis. Now if you want to go a little bit more advanced, you can also specify 2 axes at a given time. So let's say I want to grab this, I want to move this box around, but I only want to move it on the X and Y, but not on the Z. So I want to move it basically left and right and forward and backwards, but I don't want to move it up and down. So to do that, we press G to move it, and then you want to press Shift and then the axes that you want to exclude. So in this instance, we want to exclude the z-axis. So I'm going to press Shift Z. Now it's only going to move on the X and the Y axes. So let's try that again with 2 different axes. Maybe we want to move it on the Y and the Z, but we want to exclude the X axis. So I'm going to press G and then Shift X because we want to exclude the X axis. Now you can see it's moving up and down and also on the Y axis, but it's not moving on the X axis. So don't worry if that's a little bit confusing for now, but just know that you can either just press G and X to move it in the X axis, GY to move in the Y axis, or GZ to move it in the Z axis, or you can exclude a one axis by holding Shift and then pressing that axis. Now we can do the same with rotate. So I'm going to press R to rotate, and then I'm going to press X. And now you can see it's rotating only around the X axis. I'm going to press escape to cancel that. Let's try that with the Z or the Y axis. So I'm going to press R to rotate and then Y to rotate around the Y axis. Now we can do the same with the Z axis. So I'm going to press R to rotate and then Z to rotate only around the Z axis. Now let's look at scale. So select the object, press S to scale, and then I'm going to press X. And now it's going to scale only on the X axis. Let's try the same for the Y axis. So press S to scale and then Y. And now it's going to scale on the Y axis. Let's press escape and let's try the same for the Z axis. So I'm going to press S to scale and then Z to only scale in the Z axis, as you can see there. Okay, let's press escape to cancel that. And we've looked at duplicate already, so you can do Shift D and then I can press X and it's going to only move, or it's going to move that duplicated copy only on the X axis. You can also just press Y to move it on the Y axis or Z to move it on the Z axis. And then I can click and it's going to kind of position it, or it's going to lock its position wherever I clicked. You can obviously move it again. You can click on it and press G and maybe X to move it on the X axis. Maybe let's duplicate this one again and press Y and then move it on the Y axis. So that's an easy way to move things around just by using these different axes. Now let's delete these 2 cubes. And I quickly want to talk about scale. Click on your cube object and then press N for November to bring up this side menu that we looked at earlier. Now as you can see, we've got our location, our rotation, and our scale. Now the scale is currently set to 1, 1, 1. So it's a 1 scale on the X axis, 1 scale on the Y axis, and a 1 scale on the Z axis. Now if I scale this object, let's just press S and scale it. you can see that the scale value is now increased to 1.508. If I scale it smaller, you'll see that we can go below 1, so it's 0.491. And if we scale in one axis, like if I press S and X, you'll see that it will only affect one of these axes over here. So the X-axis is now 1.196, and the Y and Z has got a different number. You can obviously click here and drag as well to adjust the scale from this from these parameters. You can do that as well. But just something that I want to note when doing any scale adjustments inside of Blender. It's always good practice to reset the scale value back to 1. So these scale values here, X, Y, Z, they should always be 1, 1, 1. Now obviously if you change your object and you scale it on the X, you're going to have different parameters here. Now there's a really easy way to reset these numbers back to 1. Now let's quickly talk about why this is important to have a scale of 1, 1, 1. The problem comes in every time you will now do some 3D modeling on this object with a scale that's not set to 1, 1, 1. That can cause issues when doing things like an inset or a bevel or different edit parameters on this object. It's going to try and use these scale values for the different axes of this object. I know that sounds a little bit complicated or a bit confusing, but it's always just good practice to try and keep the scale of an object to 1. Now let me show you quickly how easy it is to reset this object scale to 1, 1, 1, because obviously we've scaled it now, but you don't want these funny values here on the side. So very easy to do that. Select your object and then press Ctrl A. Now Ctrl A is going to bring up the apply menu, and you simply click on scale, and that basically means it's going to apply the scale transformations. So let's click on scale, and I can see these scale values have reset back to 1. So now I can go and I can start 3D modeling or start editing this object, and I won't have any problems with insets or bevels or extrusions or anything that we're going to look at in a later lesson. So just keep in mind, every time you scale an object, you want to apply its scale by pressing Ctrl A and then just selecting scale from the menu. You can also apply the scale by using menus. There's always different ways to do things inside of Blender. So I can also select this object, go to the object menu here above the 3D viewport, then go to apply and then click on scale. So you can either do it that way, or you can just use a shortcut Ctrl A and then click on scale and make sure that is set to 1. So those are basically how you move an object, how you scale an object, and how you rotate an object, and also how you can duplicate an object, and then how to apply the scale if you change the scale of an object. I'll see you in the next lesson.